Thanks for coming out for my talk, how your browser tracks you and what you can do about it. It's my first time at Infosec Southwest, so thanks for having me. First of all, who am I and why should you listen to me? I'm a security engineer and technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I advise lawyers and activists on the projects that they do at EFF. And I also work on software projects such as HTTPS Everywhere and Panopticlick, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Well, what is EFF? You probably know, but this guy didn't. This is John Legere, CEO of T-Mobile. When last year he asked us, part B of my answer is, who the fuck are you anyway, EFF? Why are you stirring up so much trouble? And who pays you? So we could have just looked at our Twitter, our Facebook, asked any of you, but instead he kind of just decided to go on Twitter and shoot his mouth off. So who the fuck are you, EFF? Let's get into the first question. Well, we are an organization, a 501c3 nonprofit based in San Francisco, supported by members. We do legal work. We sue the NSA, most notably, after the Snowden revelations on First and Fourth Amendment grounds. We also fight against legislation which is overbearing and oppressive, like the CFAA and the DMCA and other legislation that kind of tries to criminalize you guys. Thank you. So we have a Coders' Rights project, which really makes sure that security researchers don't go to jail for doing the stuff that you guys do. Why are you stirring up so much trouble? Well, it's kind of our job to do so. That's what our members expect us to do. That's why we do it. We are not only a nonprofit, but we lead things like protests to stop mass surveillance and lead coalitions in organizing for a better world. We do other things like we flew a blimp over the NSA data center in Utah saying illegal spying happening below. That was fun. Most recently, we had an election. I don't know if you guys heard about it. It's pretty big news, I guess. But Silicon Valley's threat model just changed, and changed a lot. So what we're doing is we're advising Silicon Valley on what they can do, how to not keep persistent logs, how to erase them, how to have a sane data retention policy without sacrificing some of their incident responses. And also advising them on how to do end-to-end encryption and other things like that. These are just some of the steps that companies in the Bay and elsewhere can take to protect their users' data. We have a world-class, not to make a pun, international team that is working against things like Wassenaar, which is a multilateral agreement which would also criminalize some of the hacking tools that people use. Who pays you? You guys do, and I thank you for that. We also get member donations from all sorts of groups, all sorts of people, a lot of matching donations from companies as well. The vast majority of our funding comes from just individuals like you trying to help out, and that's awesome. So John Legere was like, okay, let me be clear. It's not that I don't know what EFF is. It's that I was just trying to be controversial, blah, blah. So okay, let's give him a pass, whatever. The guy, he's under a lot of pressure, right? So the technologies that we develop are, I developed something called HTTPS Everywhere, which you might have installed in your browser. It makes sure that if there is an HTTPS endpoint available for the site that you're visiting, they're actually accessing that HTTPS endpoint, not the insecure version of that site. Certbot, which is the client side of the Let's Encrypt project. So Let's Encrypt is its own organization, and a lot of the folks and technologists at EFF work on the client side, which is Certbot, written in Python. There's we actually used to call the client side Let's Encrypt until we decided to switch branding a little bit. So now let's get into the meat of the presentation, surveillance on the web. So surveillance on the web starts when the web starts in the 90s, but it really hits an all-time high when People like Glenn Fleischman wrote this article for the New York Times, really kind of lamenting the fact that browser cookies can be used to track users. The web was always somewhere where your IP address was, kept in logs, and you had a certain amount of user data that was being stored. But what was happening was that instead of just a simple lookup table where you would go to a URL and get data from that URL, the cookies dynamic started taking place, or more and more information about users was being sucked up by websites and by servers. You can see here an illustration that CNN and the New York Times are including all sorts of different third-party tracking elements, but also it's not just trackers. The third-party include fonts and include JavaScript, which may not be malicious, for instance. So why focus on third-party trackers particularly? Well, first, they're non-consensual. I never ask to be tracked when I'm visiting a site. Second of all, it's very, very difficult to avoid them. They're all over the web. And for instance, they're just ubiquitous at this point. You can't go to a website and be sure that you're not being tracked by some third-party tracker at this point. And then there's a strong financial incentive to gather data about you. Your data is actually big money. You can see the New York Times has dozens of third-party sites that are collecting data about you, and this is a disconnect list. If you had the extension disconnect, you can see for any given site what third parties are tracking you in a very nice graphic like that. And these are delivered to advertisers to market products at you. You might think that this is great, right? I'm getting some kind of targeted advertising that's much better than some random advertising, right? But say you're in a zip code that's far away from a Walmart, and you're trying to buy a product that's also available at that Walmart. Well, that site might give you a higher price for that product than if you live in the same zip code as a Walmart. So there's differential pricing schemes. Ashkan Soltani actually covered a lot of how this works in his work. You also have these Diploma Mills, and this is a really kind of pernicious dynamic where low-income folks, maybe you're a person of color in a low-income zip code, then these are, you're heavily marketed, these Diploma Mills, which gives you degrees that aren't really worth the paper that they're printed on. So you spend thousands and thousands, or tens of thousands of dollars to get a worthless degree. So this is a predatory practice that is enabled by trackers and third-party trackers predominantly. And web trackers do big data analysis on you all the time. And you don't really have any way to opt out. In the US, there's no good data protection regime. They do it without your consent, and you have just no recourse. Here are some of the key players. Some of them you know, like Google and Facebook, and others like Scorecard Research, Axicom, you might not know. So there are like this kind of broad array of companies that just do tracking and are doing it behind the scenes. And some companies, like DoubleClick, when it was acquired by Google, that do it with a front-facing company that you might be aware of. Third-party tracking is also really useful for the NSA and other three-letter agencies because they create big data silos and big data targets that you can easily hack, for instance, if they don't have their security up to par. So it's great for the NSA if they want user data to hack one of these endpoints and get all your data that you have been collecting on you for years and years. This August 2016 study of web trackers by University of Washington researchers, including Yoshi Kono, found that at least 75% of the Alexa top 500 internet sites contain trackers, and that was up from a little bit less than 5% in 1998. So this is really something that's becoming worse and worse. And not only is it becoming worse and worse, it's becoming, the complexity of these trackers are becoming more complex over time. And again, they're everywhere that you might go. So you have Cookie Monster taking all your cookies and learning more and more about you, right? So the original article in 1999 10 years later, Ed Felton from in Freedom to Tinker wrote this article about how he was reminiscing on the good old days when trackers would just track you based on cookies and not on everything else. And the everything else is what I'm going to get into next. This kind of idea that the cookies are the transparent way to track users shows just how bad things had gotten by this point. So what happened in the 10 years between 1999 and 2009? These guys happened. Flash, Java, and Silverlight. These can be used as persistent stores of data in your browser. They basically punch holes in the security model of your browser. And what's worse, the security researcher Semi Kamkar came up with this idea of the ever cookie, which means that if you don't delete cookies, basically these three platforms and your browser itself can collude in respawning cookies if they're not deleted from each one of them at the same exact time. So if I delete my cookies in Flash and Silverlight, but not Java, then the Java code can propagate the cookies right back. And you need to be very sure that you're deleting everything at the same time, simultaneously, so that you're actually not respawning those cookies. This is the idea of the ever cookie, that it's very, very difficult to use normal mechanisms within the browser. This achieves a level of persistence that's very, very difficult to break. Not only do we have cookies and persistent stores of data, we also have fingerprinting. Fingerprinting looks like this, right? You have fonts that are enumerated on a site that you're visiting, or you deliver these web headers, and you have those that are little bits of information about you delivered to the site that you're going to. And these are little bits of information, and they can be combined to kind of form a cohesive whole about what your unique fingerprint is, what the signature of your browser is over time. So we had a pretty good idea that you could be uniquely identified via your browser and fingerprinting techniques in your browser. But as data-driven technologists, we wanted to get some concrete and hard statistics about how easy it was. So in January 2010, we launched Panopticlick 1.0. And Panopticlick was basically an experiment where volunteers would go to the site, and they could learn how unique their browser was when they measured it against other browsers. But it was also a way for us to gather data about their users and see how unique an individual user might be based on their fingerprinting characteristics. So as I said, it's a mixture of header and JavaScript detected properties. You can use user agent, HTTPS or HTTP accept cookies, and the JavaScript detected properties like enumeration of plugins you can do in JavaScript or Flash, I believe, too, if you have plugin. Time zone, screen resolution, font, and super cookies. So there's all sorts of different metrics that you can use and combine in order to get a good measurement of what your fingerprint is. So later on in 2010, we gathered all the data that we had about the Panopticlick experiment, and we found that 84% of browsers could be uniquely identified based on the signature that they give off with fingerprinting techniques. When you have Flash installed, that's 94%. So the vast majority of users could actually be uniquely identified just based on their browser fingerprint. And if that wasn't bad enough, there are all sorts of new techniques that have come along since we launched Panopticlick in 2010. Show of hands, how many people know what this is describing here? A few of you? Cool. This is called canvas fingerprinting. And what it does is it renders text onto an HTML5 canvas element. And because of the unique configuration of the fonts and, say, your operating system or your system configuration, it may be unique. And when you serialize the image that it generates and run a hashing function over it, then it's actually like something that stays constant throughout multiple browser runs, but it's different for every specific configuration that you might have. So this turns out to be a really, really good technique for getting a browser fingerprint, a really good metric for identifying your browser. You can see here one example of canvas fingerprinting in the wild. This is this weird overlay of different shapes and colors and UTF characters. And this is in order to maximize the chance that the generated image will actually be unique and have a good fingerprint for you. In the intervening years, so AddThis and Ligatus started doing this type of tracking in 2014. And University of Princeton researchers started calling them out on it. There's this paper called The Web Never Forgets in 2014. And these researchers said, hey, look, AddThis, Ligatus, you should really not be doing this. This isn't a privacy protective way to do things. And because of all the negative media attention that AddThis and Ligatus got, they stopped doing it. But this technique is still very, very available to other trackers. There's also web audio context fingerprinting. So you have a sample. It's not recorded from your computer, but you have some image of some WAV file or something like that. And you do a transform on it. And the transform is actually dependent on your audio, your sound card configuration, and all that. And if you run, if you render that to a buffer and then run a hashing function on that buffer, then that's another great fingerprinting metric. This is a very new technique. This was just premiered in last year, basically. Not only is there web tracking, but a company called Silverpush started doing this really creepy thing. What they started doing is they would incentivize apps to include their SDK in their smartphone web app or smartphone apps. And when Silverpush, actually, they would kind of partner with advertising agencies to have this above audio frequency audio, basically it's too high for the human ear to hear it, but it was an audio beacon that was emitted from your TV. And the devices that had your iPad over there or your Android phone over here, they were within audio range, then they would recognize that the TV was emitting this, and they would be able to sync up and recognize that you're the same user in the same house. So this is cross-device tracking. And the most ridiculous thing about it is that it's like, why would you have it outside of the human audible range unless you're just trying to hide it from users? It's real obvious. My dog gets pissed off about it, though. In January 2016, there was this study by the same Princeton researchers using OpenWPM, which is basically doing a scan of the Alexa top 1,000,000 sites and seeing what third parties are included on each of those sites. And they had some interesting findings. So you can see that Google Analytics is by and far the top tracker on the web. And that's almost 70% of websites include Google Analytics. That's pretty crazy if you think about it. There are others, but the curve really kind of tapers off after the 9th tracker. Then it's not included on any more than 10% of the web. So by and large, it's kind of front-loaded where all these first-party trackers are actually occurring, mostly on Google Analytics and DoubleClick, which is another Google company. This is really interesting, too. The #1 type of site that does third-party tracking is news. And the category of the least tracking is porn. Kind of counterintuitive, but I guess if you're looking at porn, you really don't want to be tracked. So the key findings from this are third parties are really major roadblocks in HTTPS adoption as well. So if you have some resources that are included on an HTTP site, and you're including third-party trackers or ad agencies or whatever that you're getting revenue from, and those resources aren't available over HTTPS, then when you try to move to HTTPS, because of mixed content blocking in the browser, that gets blocked. And you are losing revenue at that point. And so what they found was that mixed content blocking would affect about 24% of HTTPS or HTTP sites that wish to move to HTTPS. What they also found is that Firefox's third-party cookie blocking was very effective, and I'll get into that in a minute. Additionally, canvas fingerprinting has really increased over time, even though AddThis and LinkThis kind of stopped doing it. And it's kind of interesting how it has increased, right? It's not just trackers that are doing it. If you're click fraud, if you're doing click fraud and you are using some automated browsing tool, then if you're doing canvas fingerprinting to detect that that's an incidence of fraud, then that's a really good way to actually find those fraudsters. And so fraud detection is using tracking or using fingerprinting more and more. Audio context fingerprinting was present in only 3 scripts that they found, but this was in January 2016, so I'm sure that it's increased since then. And in 715 of the top Alexa million sites, they use WebRTC Local Ip Discovery. This is crazy. This is basically like using the WebRTC API to enumerate which IPs are present in your LAN and actually your network configuration and all this kind of crap. And it's really like, why would you expose that in the first place? Unless it's absolutely necessary. Maybe it is. So the argument is that I really like targeted ads. What's wrong with those? But consider that you don't have any control over how your information is stored, how it propagates through the internet. Third-party have no obligation to anonymize your data. They have no obligation to not keep your data forever. So this is really scary, too. Your data can be sold to the top bidder or just stolen because it's a huge pool of data that's just sitting out there for everyone to steal and hack. And there's misuse of ad targeting by malware agencies or whatever. So why should you care about privacy? Well, you may want to read things that are controversial or embarrassing. Maybe you have a medical condition and you want to research that. That's a really good way to care about your privacy, right? You might be, have data which is embarrassing, but it's not immediately available unless you put together the dots. And third-party trackers do just that. They basically form this picture of you across the web. And when put together, then it can form a really embarrassing picture about you. You may be opposed to geotargeting for political reasons. Or you might just be worried about the chilling effects of targeted advertisers or targeting or trackers just kind of following you around on the web in general. I like this quote. Privacy lets us make mistakes, play with ideas, and grow as individuals. It gives us the space to discover who we actually are. And this is something that Glenn Greenwald talks about in his book, this kind of phenomenon where if you feel like you're being watched, then you do this self-censorship. And this is limiting the way that people can express themselves. So privacy allows us to act in a more free manner, and it should be a basic principle in any free society. I'm not sure if I have time to play this, but this is a really depressed cat. I'm feeling like this right now. Because, look, these trackers are everywhere. We can't do anything about them. What are we going to do? Well, I'm here to say that all hope is not lost, that rebellions are built on hope, and that we can do something about it. And the way that we do something about it is kind of interesting. There are good and bad efforts on this front. There are good and bad efforts to stop tracking. First of all, Flash prevalence on websites since 5 years ago has gone way down, from just under 50% at the end of 2011 to just about 10% in October 2016. This is an encouraging trend, and it's not just Flash. Things like Silverlight and Java are going the way of the dinosaurs. People don't run them anymore. And if your website's based on them, then you kind of are not going to make any money because no one uses it. So Flash and burn. There's other things like the Tor browser. The Tor browser is great because they have anonymity in mind. And if your being tracked by web trackers, then your anonymity is being compromised. So what they do is they've enumerated all these different ways in which trackers can look at your identity, in which you can be fingerprinted, and they've also developed mitigations against it. So they've thought about these defenses really, really hard. And what they do is they make your browser look like every single other instance of the Tor browser. This makes it so that even if a third-party tracker is included on a website that you're visiting, that they can't really just get much data from you because you look like everyone else. This increases your anonymity set, as they call it in information theory. What they do is they patch Firefox. So basically, Tor browser is rebased from Firefox ESR. And Firefox, the extended support release, what they do is Tor browser patches Firefox, compiles it again, and adds some add-ons, for instance, HTTPS Everywhere and Tor Launcher, and that's what they call Tor browser. So they've built in these protections into Firefox, actually. And they also thought about things that aren't really related to web tracking, but things like IP unlinkability or unique identifiers. But Tor browser is kind of annoying to use. It's not the most usable thing in the world, but it's also there's also differential treatment of Tor users. So if you are accessing a Cloudflare site, you might have to enter a CAPTCHA 10 times before you actually are able to see the content you want to see. And there's outright censorship. So Tor entry nodes are blocked in, say, if you're in a censorship regime like China. But wouldn't it be great if these protections were built back into Firefox? So the Firefox Uplift project is doing just that. In Tor's blog last year, they announced in this article by Ethan Singh and Richard Barnes that a lot of the protections that are built into Tor browser are actually making their way behind Firefox prefs. So as time goes on, you'll have more and more protection against fingerprinting if you're using Firefox, if you set a few preferences flags in your preferences, basically. This might make the web a little bit less usable because it will disable certain APIs of the feature-rich web. But maybe that's OK if you are just checking your bank account instead of, I don't know, playing Duke Nukem in browsers. So there's also a Firefox tracker protection, which is available in private browsing mode. And so what they've done is they've implemented the disconnect list. So if you're using disconnect, and you're using that in private browsing mode, basically all these trackers are blocked by default. Out of the box, if you're using private browsing mode, it's using this blacklist. And this is what it looks like. So if you see that, then you can know that you're protected. Some less effective means of protecting you against web trackers: incognito mode in Chrome. I know you're security researchers, right? So you love Chrome. And there's a lot of good reasons why you should love Chrome from a security perspective. But they really don't give a fuck about your privacy. It's not meant to stop tracking. It doesn't block any type of fingerprinting. It doesn't even block super cookies. So consider if you're trying not to be tracked and you're trying to be anonymous using Firefox in, say, like a VM or something. Ad blockers aren't also a good way to block tracking. Mostly, they just block ads. And if they're an invisible tracker that's included on a site, then they don't actually attempt to block it at all. And they often have questionable business models. There's this W3c Do-Not-Track Policy. And what that does is the World Wide Web Consortium, they have this standard by which you can announce that you do not wish to be tracked. And this comes in the form of a header. You just set DNT is 1 and deliver that to the remote site. Then that opts out of being tracked. But unfortunately, there's no enforcement mechanism. The websites can just really ignore you if you say you do not want to be tracked. There's no legal protections for you in that manner. So there's a lot of websites that just ignore it. There's very low compliance on this. These efforts are great, but they really you have to be a power user if you're going to be using Tor Browser. Anyone in this room can use it, but if you are the average user, it's not protecting you because you don't know about it. And it doesn't fix the underlying problem of these trackers being everywhere and collecting data against us. But here's a thought. If we can reduce the unique bits of information that sites gather about us in the browser APIs, then we can actually stop tracking without outright blocking the trackers. So the idea is, it's like kind of mowing the lawn, right? There are all these different types of APIs that are gathering information about you. But if you reduce that to the lowest functional common denominator, then that makes it so that you're a lot less trackable because you don't have that much information that you're giving up. There are additional W3c efforts. This was a draft paper by Nick Doty. And this is a suggestion to new developers of browser specs that will become APIs. And what this has in mind is basically it defines some best practices. If you're doing a thing like font enumeration, then that's very detectable. So what you do is you render a string in some font, and then you measure the width of that string, and then you try to see whether you can change the string's font and get the width that you expect from that font, and then change it to the third font, see if they have that installed through measuring the width of that font. This process is very, very detectable. You can see that it's really shady that someone is doing this. So that's a way to actually make sure that new browser APIs are recommended to do this, to be detectable in the way that you can actually enumerate information about your browser. There's also Privacy Badger, which we develop at EFF. Privacy Badger is a browser extension. It's free and open source. You should all download it right now if you don't have it already. And it focuses on blocking trackers at the source. It does this by an algorithm and a heuristic kind of that Privacy Badger uses instead of the disconnect or ublock origin or other extensions that use blacklists or URL fragments to block resources. It allows honest actors a way out of actually being blocked as well. How does Privacy Badger actually work? Well, it tells sites that you don't wish to be tracked. It looks for those third-party as you browse the web. And if 3 first-party sites are including a third-party resource, and that third-party resource is setting cookies every time, or is doing canvas fingerprint detection every time, then that's really shady, and we block it. We see that, like, hey, this looks like a tracker, smells like a tracker, and so we block it outright. So you can see this is what Privacy Badger looks like if you're visiting boingboing.net, for instance. If you encounter some usability problems, then you can just drag this slider and selectively allow resources that you want to be loaded again. So what about sites that aren't tracking users, that are doing the good thing, but they are blocked by Privacy Badger? How do we kind of make this available, make the resources available, if they're not being like a shady tracker? We've written a new DNT. And this document is basically something that websites can put behind a well-known location in their web root and say, hey, look, we're definitely not tracking our users. And if we think they are tracking their users, then we can use this enforcement mechanism with the FTC to actually take some action against them. And this way, when they post this DNT policy behind their web root, they're selectively unblocked. This only works if you have Privacy Badger and not like other extensions. So other extensions may block that resource, again, if they don't wish to comply with the DNT policy that we've created. So the DNT policy, what does it actually say? It says that you should, as a website, remove unique identifiers for your users. Logs won't be kept for more than absolutely necessary. Data can be kept for debugging and security purposes, but not for tracking users. And data should be anonymized and aggregated for analytics purposes. So this is basically what I just explained, that Privacy Badger will selectively unblock sites that have the DNT policy behind their web root. So this is kind of a carrot and the stick approach. Here's where the DNT policy is. That's where it lives. It's been adopted by DuckDuckGo, which we know and love, AdZerk, which is actually an ad agency, Mixpanel, Medium, Disconnect, and more. So in December 2015, we launched Panopticlick 2.0. And what Panopticlick 2.0 does is it has some new features, tracker blocking detection test. So what we do is we set up a number of sites that look like shady trackers, and we run you through this test. And if your configuration of your blockers is correct, then we show a result that, hey, look, you blocked these sites. It looks like you have your software configured correctly. If it's misconfigured or absent, then we say, hey, look, you should really protect yourself. And depending on the platform, we might recommend Privacy Badger, or if you have, I think, an iPhone, then we can suggest that you use, I think it's uLox VPN or something like that. We've also implemented an ad blocking protection test. And we've open sourced the code base so that you can, and rewritten it in Python so that you can look at it yourself. It was in really shitty PHP before, trust me. We've also added 6 new fingerprinting tests because fingerprinting metrics have gotten worse and worse over time. So we want to give you a good idea of what your browser fingerprint looks like to trackers that are using cutting-edge techniques. And we've also made sure that your fingerprint is epoched. So we're measuring you up against browsers that we've seen in the recent past and not browsers that we saw in 2010, because that's not very helpful. And the results are in. The test has been run over 1.8 million times, and 1.1 million users have strong protection against tracking. This shows that users are seeing that they have shitty results, and what they do is they get better results because we suggested to them in the test, and they go and run the test again, and they get better results. That's why the number is so high, that's what we suspect. Everything is awesome, right? The web is completely untrackable now. Well, I mean, at least there's something you could do about it. Some of the next steps we want to do is identify the specific APIs in the browser that are responsible for the most bits of unique information about you, and put the onus on them to actually cut their shit, to like mitigate the fingerprintability by putting the onus and pressure on them to reduce entropy in these browser APIs. So we want to move closer to the model that Tor Browser has, where there are large anonymity pools, maybe not this one large one that is exactly what Tor Browser looks like, maybe small pockets. And that way you're not completely uniquely identifiable. You have maybe 6 or 7 users that look exactly like you. And that's good enough for most people. But it's a long way to getting to that task, and I think they were making some headway that way. That involves a 3-pronged attack at EFF, which is making advertisers track users less than the DNT policy, empowering users to block trackers through Privacy Badger, and making browsers less identifiable in general for the everyday user who can install Privacy Badger. And this is a new project that we're going to be spinning up on our activism team at EFF. So combining these 3, we can start to take control back from our, we can actually start taking control of our browsing back and stop succumbing to privacy and security nihilism, and we can actually see a new hope for the web. So I'll let that play because we want to see the Death Star explode. Tarkin? Yeah! Thanks very much. I'll open up for questions if we have time. Yeah. So you mean in Privacy Badger?
I mean in Panopticlick too.
Oh,
I just tried it on my Chromebook and it
yeah.
says my
Right. So what so basically, even if most browsers in the world are just uniquely identifiable no matter what, even if it's like an out-of-the-box Chromebook, because you set up your language and maybe you have some sort of add-on installed, or even that those small steps that you've taken just setting it up are enough to make you uniquely identifiable. And that's really scary, but I think that we can move in a better direction. I'm not sure if I understand your question, though.
What I'm saying is, like, yeah, it knows I'm using Chrome, but maybe it could remove the Chrome version number because that's not necessarily interesting to a person or a machine because that will change regularly.
So what the smartest trackers do is link your identity even though you've upgraded your browser version. So with Panopticlick, we have this very unique fingerprint for you that's a hash of all those metrics. And if you update your browser, then that linkability will be broken. I think that you can do that, but a lot of the feature-rich web depends on what specific version you have installed, because if you're a shitty programmer, then you're like, okay, if I have Firefox if I use the user agent, then I can detect that Firefox, after 45 has this feature enabled, and use that as rendering this one specific version of the page, versus before that rendering another version of the page. But I think that you can probably get closer to a better anonymity result if you do mitigate some of the bits of information, because your user agent does really give out a lot of information. Yeah. Yeah.
So can you confound these trackers by using people and devices aren't one-to-one? So if multiple people use one device and a person uses several devices, does it do anything, or are they too smart for that?
Well, so this is just dealing with browser linkability. So this is like browser tracking. But there are other techniques which are behavioral fingerprinting.
Well, in that case, using multiple different browsers.
So your typing patterns can actually be fingerprinted, and that's behavioral fingerprinting. And that's a really hard thing to mitigate against. One of the things that the Tor browser does is they've made the granularity of the JavaScript tick operation to 100 milliseconds. And that mitigates against some of that. Unfortunately, that's a very subvertible thing that you can actually figure it out anyway. But they do take some steps in that direction to mitigate not just browser fingerprinting, but your unique identity based on behavioral fingerprinting as well. Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting question, because if your fingerprint looks like everyone else in your office or your home, then you're not exactly uniquely identifiable, but you look like a pool of anyone else that's on that LAN. So maybe, but if you're the only one that has that, if you're a single person in your own home that uses your internet connection, then that's a lot more uniquely identifiable because your IP directly is. So you could use a VPN that has strong privacy policy or something like that, in combination with fingerprint mitigation techniques. Yeah, I think that I might be running low on time, so thanks very much.